Hello and welcome to my channel. In today's video we're going to be doing this apple using watercolour, and we're going to do a little bit of a drawing first, and I'm going to be doing that on the Bockingford block, which as you can see is £140 or 300 grams not pressed. So that's the one that I would recommend to use. It doesn't have to be this brand, but £140 not pressed, or sometimes they're labelled cold pressed. So if we take a look at this apple, we've got a really dark shadow here and a very bright highlight, so it's a lovely photograph to work from. So getting these contrasts between the highlights and the shadow is what we're going to be looking at doing today. We don't really need to worry about what's happening in this side of the picture, there's not much going on there, but you can see the camera is really focused on the apple and the branch here, and we don't need to worry too much about what we're doing in the background. We'll just look at these shadows on the apple itself. So to begin with, we need to do a very loose pencil drawing, and then we'll put all the detail in with our watercolour paints. So we'll start with the apple itself, and I will put a link to this picture in the description below. So the apple's sort of hanging at slightly an angle. If you want to measure this and make it more accurate, then that's fine, go ahead and measure. I don't like measuring, I like to do things by my eye, but if you'd like to measure at this point you can do. Just measure the width compared to the depth and see if you've got that right. But of course don't forget, all apples are different and doesn't have to be exact. So we've got a little dip going up there at the bottom, but we can't actually see what's under here, but we can see that dip. And then of course we've got the stalk going out here somewhere, and that's going quite vertical actually, so that's going nicely up like that. You may not be able to see too much of this detail because I'm drawing quite lightly. Just some nice guidelines, and I will rub out one or two of these scribbly lines once I tighten it up a bit. Going out a little bit more this way and across from here. Okay, so once we've positioned the apple, we've got a leaf up here. Again, don't worry too much about being exact. Nobody's going to have that leaf in front of them to judge your picture. And then we've got, I'm not sure what you would call it, this little bud here coming off. So look at where it is in relation to the apple itself, and that will help you position it. So look at the space here and the space here and the shape of this space here. As I say in all my videos, you're obviously going to have quite a bit more time than I have, hopefully, to do this. You won't need to rush, you can do it over a couple of days or whatever, whereas I'm trying to do it in a few minutes to show you, so you can be a lot more accurate with your measurements if you really want to be. But just think about the basic shapes and where they are in relation to each other. And this leaf here is curling across slightly over the top one, so the more you look at these photographs the more you see, and we can tell that that leaf's curling over, and then it goes off the top of the photo, then we don't see it. So then we need the branching, and the branch comes along and down and then across. And look at the width of the branch compared to the width of the apple, so it's probably that kind of width. But again, we can't see a lot of that because it's going off, so you might want to imagine a bit more shape to it. And just put the top line on there that we can't actually see, and I'll also put a little bit more of the stem here so that we know that that apple's attached to a tree and not just floating in mid-air. So it goes down. Just going to alter this. I'm going to come further across with that. So you may have noticed that I've not put these background leaves in. We've got some leaves here and this one here. They're a little bit further away than the apple, so I thought it'd be quite nice just to do those in paint and not actually do a pencil drawing for those, and just make them fade away into the background a bit more rather than making them jump forward by doing them in more detail. So what I'm going to do now, before I start putting any paint on, if we look here, we've got this really sharp highlight where the light's catching underneath this apple, and that is the lightest place. Actually, it's quite light on here as well, right in the centre there and here. So those little highlights I'm just going to pop in to begin with some of the masking fluid. So this is a Winsor & Newton masking fluid, and I use a shaper to put this on. So this one's a taper point and it's a size 0, and you can see that's just a little rubber tip, and the thing about that is the masking fluid just comes off it quite easily once it's dry. The only thing with these Winsor & Newton pots, and I may have mentioned this before, is they're very difficult to get off. I keep a pair of pliers in my studio handy to get these tops off. So they're so childproof that I can't get them off. Okay, so just a tiny bit of the masking fluid, and look carefully at where that highlight is. It comes part way up the apple there, and then it's a bit thicker towards the bottom there. And that's enough, because you really don't want to overdo your highlights, don't want to make them thicker. There's a tiny little highlight here. Just be very sparing with these, less is more. So with this tape you can just get a tiny bit on the end, just on the underside of that leaf there. A little bit on this leaf here, and that is enough. We don't need to be covering the whole thing with highlights, it'll look way too busy. So what you need to do now is leave that to dry naturally. I don't dry this with my hairdryer, it's not a good idea. It can sometimes sticks more to the paper when you do it with your hairdryer. With masking fluid, don't put it on and then leave your picture for weeks on end before you come back to it, because that's when you end up with problems. Sometimes when you take the masking fluid off, you'll tear your paper, and that's usually when you've left it too long. So I wouldn't leave it any more than 24 hours before you get your picture done and you take that masking fluid off. Whilst we're waiting for that masking fluid to dry, I'm going to mix a few colours up in the palette, and we're going to use this Phthalo Green Light, which comes in the Sennelier travel set. Really nice bright green, which we have in this apple. And some of the darker forest green, which you can see where it gets its name. It's a lovely dark colour there. Try and make your paints of a similar consistency to each other, particularly when you're working wet in wet. And we need some of the yellow, I think, because it's very bright down that one side, and we've got some yellow showing through the leaves as well. And I will add to these colours as I go along, but it's good to have some ready made up before you begin. And we need some sort of a browny colour. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a look here. Got some sort of browns and yellows in the background there. Not many colours in this photograph, but we will. I'm just thinking the sienna might be too red, but it's perhaps as near as we're going to get with that. We could put something in there to tone that down. Might even add a little bit of the green to that, just to knock it back a bit. It's quite ready. Something on the opposite side of the colour wheel might just help to make it more brown. And that's quite a nice colour for that, I think. So we'll stick with those for now, but we've got plenty more there to go at, and we'll probably use some of this yellow, and we've got an extra more browns here as well. So now the masking fluid's dry, you can see it's gone slightly yellow. You can actually buy a blue coloured one as well, which makes them easier to show up. But make sure it's dry before you start the next stage of doing your painting. Today I'm not going to wet the paper first, I'm going to work wet on to dry, and I'm going to begin with this lovely green colour. Now, although this is quite a small brush, it does hold quite a lot of paint. It's a sable brush and one of my favourite ones. So this is a size 3. You could work with something slightly bigger, but just make sure it has a nice point to it, so that you can keep that accuracy. So I'm going to cover the whole thing with this. And it's going to be drying quite quickly today because it's a very hot day here again. So keep coming back to your edges. Don't allow one side to dry whilst you're working on the other side, because in this weather you'll find that that soon dries and then you'll end up with a hard edge. There are ways you can remedy that, but it's easier not to let it happen in the first place. So it's a nice accurate brush and I can get a nice line on the edge of my apple there. Any of these little pencil lines that are showing I can erase later on. When you're painting an object that's spherical like this, try and keep your arm and your hand moving in the direction of the object. It's going to look much more convincing if your brush strokes are in that direction. So I've got some of the yellow and I'm going to put that where I feel I can see it on the apple. We've got a little bit up here. And then it comes right across here and up to the top here where the sun's shining on there. And this will look much lighter once we get the dark shades in on the other side. So for now what I'm going to do with that is leave it to dry. And whilst that's drying I can work on another area of the picture. So I'm going to turn my paper round to make it easier. And I'm going to put this brown colour that we made on the whole of this trunk, even though it's covered in some kind of lichen. I'm going to just start by putting this onto the whole trunk. So carefully around those leaves that are just crossing over there. And just by turning your page it makes it so much easier to get to where you need to be. So don't forget to do that, don't be stuck in one position. And also move your own position as well, as particularly if you stand to work, which I do recommend. If you stand to work you've got much more movement in your arm. I don't always when I'm doing these videos because of where the camera is and things. But if you haven't worked standing up at an easel, give it a try. You'll find you become much more freer with your painting. Because things aren't tight in your wrist, you're able to move more. And whilst that's still wet, we'll add some of that green into it for that lichen. And this is why you need these paints to be of a similar consistency. When you're dropping them into each other, they have to be of a similar consistency, otherwise they will dry at different rates, and then that's when you end up with what we call a cauliflower shape or a bloom. It's much greener at this end, where it's more in the canopy. Obviously there's more moisture there, so this lichen's growing. And we'll turn that round and leave that to dry as well. And whilst that's drying we can have a look at the stalk. So again with the stalk I'm going to use the green and go across onto those leaves as well. And you can see that that apple's drying very quickly already. Like I said, it's very, very hot in here. It's actually a little bit too warm to be working in here today. Which that branch isn't just dry, but don't worry if you touch it because we've already got that colour in there, it's not going to matter. And just go over the whole of that leaf, and you can go straight across the top of the masking fluid, you don't have to go around it. That's what it's there for. That would only matter if you hadn't let it dry properly. You don't really want to touch there because you don't want that brown coming in to the leaf too much. But like I say, it's already drying, so it's not really a problem. Here we want this to be green. Very light actually, this. And then we want the stalk part of it to have that brown on. You'll see lots of little fine hairs as well on this, the bottom of the apple even, and on these little bit here. We're not going to worry too much about those today. We're just going to do the basic shape of all this. A little bit of the brown there. We'll just pop that in while it's still wet. Got something going on under there with a little bit of pods and seeds and things, whatever they are. And I think for now we're going to leave that to dry. Now that's all dry, we can continue to work on it, and I just want to point out how lovely these colours are now that they've dried. This brown that I mixed out of the forest green and the, what was it, the burnt sienna, look how it's separated, and we've got this little crisp edge to the branch here. That's really nice how that's done, and we've got a nice crisp edge here as well. And that's partly because we use the wet on dry technique, and it's just gone out to where that dry paper is. This paper's completely dry, so where that edge is, where we went up to it, it's made a lovely crisp line where those colours have separated. So you need to get to know your colours as well, because some do this much more nicely than others. Sometimes you don't want this to happen as well, so that's another reason you need to know these things. But yeah, just carefully observe how your different colours from your different ranges of watercolour work and separate on the paper. So to begin with, I want to work down this stem, and we need to be a little bit darker. So I'm going to start with some of this forest green. At the top here, it's really very much in shade. It's quite a blue green, this, and I'm just going to put it down most of that side of the stem. And under here. And down here. And then if we look, we've got the shadow underneath this leaf here. Just gives us that impression that it's all folding over. And similarly with this one, this is all in shadow from the trunk above, and where it curls at the end, the leaves are obviously a different colour on the underside. They're much paler on the underside. And again, we've got shadow down this side of here. And I know we've got other things going on and more colours there, but we can come back and put those on later. We're going to work quite patiently and just build it up wet on dry. Now before I go any further, I'm just looking at these little dots on the apple itself, which aren't white. They're not nowhere near as bright as this highlight we've got here, but we do want them to show afterwards. So I'm just going to put some dots over the top of this paint that we've already got. And of course this means we're going to have to be patient again and leave these to dry before we can come back and put the shadow down that side of the apple. So we'll leave that now to dry. So whilst that masking fluid's drying, we can start with putting these leaves behind. And so what I'm going to do with that, I'm going to use a slightly bigger brush now that's got a really nice point on it, and we're going to just make a very impressionistic leaf shape coming across out of water in roughly the same place that we can see it here. Just touching that stem and then across to where the branch is, and then into here. Use the tip of your brush to get into there. And it doesn't touch that little bud, it comes down here, and just make a very loose imaginary leaf shape at the end there. We want it to be quite impressionistic. It doesn't have to be just like it is on the picture. and when you're painting with water you can't see the shape that you're making, so just very loosely get that in the area that you want it. And then we want it quite dark, we don't want it as light as the apple. And just leave the paint to flow into where you've put the water. Leave it quite hazy. Don't overpaint it, just drop those colours in. So I've got that forest green in. It needs to look as if it's behind the apple. On the photograph you can see much more detail in this leaf, but we want to make it look quite hazy and make it move away. So we're just going to drop the colours in. So a little bit of yellow, and some of the paler green. Just go a bit heavier there. And then we want to leave that to dry. There are some more leaves, there's some up here and here, so how many of those you pop in is up to you. I'm just thinking maybe it does need something here just to bring the eye back around towards that apple. So we need to think about the composition. We don't just want to be slavishly copying the composition off the photograph. So I'm just tidying up there where I feel it needs it. So just watch as that dries. Make sure the water isn't pooling as it can do, because this isn't an expensive paper. Just lift that out with a dry brush. But yeah, I think it needs, because we've got the apple here and the branch here, I think it needs something to bring the eye back towards the apple. Okay, so at the moment those two leaves look like they're jumping forwards. That's because everything on here is dry and it's looking paler. Those are wet, so they're looking like they're brighter. When they're dry they'll fade backwards, and because we're going to be putting more work on these foreground things. So as we wait for those leaves to dry and for the apple masking fluid to dry, let's just put some more detail on this tree. It's not that easy because it's going off the photograph and we haven't got all the detail there, so some of this can be a little bit imagined. Some shapes here around where there's a knot. And then we've got just one or two lines to give us an impression of a bit more texture. So just do this quite loosely. And then we need some more of that green of the lichen on there. And a little bit of the yellow perhaps as well in places where it's a bit brighter. I'm just going to pop some yellow into that green there. I don't know if you can see on the picture, but there's quite a bit of yellow where the light's shining. Just felt that was a bit too uniform there. Just break those lines up a little bit with a damp brush. Now I'm making a mess. I think we'll leave that dry and we'll come and put some more shadow over the top of it. I'm just going to put some green here. I don't know if you can see on the photograph, it's quite green at this end. Go over the top of some of that mess that I've made. And it's just building up a few layers and letting those colours merge together. Now as we still wait for that to dry, I'm going to come back up to this stem, pop a little bit of yellow down this side and here, and on this leaf, it's quite shiny. These are completely dry now where I'm painting over the top of them. And I also need more of that brown colour on here. And some broken lines on here because it's kind of textured. Tiny bit of brown on the stem there, and here it is dry on the apple. I'll just pop that shape in there of that shadow, which is quite brown. You often get a little bit of brown on your apple there, don't you? So look carefully at that shape. We can't see the edge where the stem comes out. We can't see into that dimple. We can just see the other side of it. So that's all going to help give you that impression of this being a spherical shape. And these lines going up like this. Now everything's completely dry, I'm going to put the shadow on this apple. I'm going to start, I think I'm going to use both of the greens, so I'm going to start with the lighter green and put it where I can see it, so it comes behind here, behind that stem, by getting that there, which the stem shows up more. Go over the top of that brown that's already there, because you know it's adding to that shadow and deepening the shadow so that the highlights show up more. It comes out and then it comes down here and then slightly across. And don't be worried about leaving that hard edge here, because there is a hard edge on that shadow. It's a very defined shadow. Lots of people don't like hard edges, but if that's what we're seeing, which we do with shadows, then that's how it should be. Sort of kinks out a little bit more, doesn't it? Maybe I've gone too far across now with that to get that shape in, but never mind. And it's only being quite bold with your shadows that's going to make your highlights show up and be more impressive. Or eye-catching is probably the word I'm looking for. So now I'll go on to the darker one and just let it drop in and move around. And again, go in the shape of the apple. Move your brush in the shape of the apple. I'm just going to, with a damp brush, so wash your brush off and then squeeze the extra out with your thumb. I'm just going to soften this area here and let that be a bit more hazy, because if you look at the photograph you'll see that's much more hazy than the rest of the shadow. Just let it bleed in a little touch there. Here it's pooling a bit, so I'll just move it up. Just make that shape a bit more accurate at the bottom there. And then we can leave that to completely dry. So we're not going to touch these background leaves anymore, we're going to leave them there. We perhaps want a little bit more detail on these foreground leaves. One or two little lines and shapes just to bring them a bit more to life. And I think we need a darker brown. So at this stage I'm going to go and get some colour straight from the pans here. And I've just got a touch of warm sepia on my brush. Straight from the pan, nice and thick, to put some of these little lines and shapes that we can see on here. In the end of here. And again, it's just giving us a lot more contrast, but it's giving us more detail in that area that's bringing it forward. Could also use some of that to make some more of these shapes around this knot. And any kind of knocks and bumps on this branch. It's difficult knowing with this how much detail to put in your branch here, really. I'm going to get some of the darker green straight from the pan and perhaps pop one or two shadowy bits in, mossy bits, whatever they are. Actually, I don't like that. Just going to soften that off. That's better, I didn't like that. I don't think I want to do too much more on that branch, but it does feel like it needs to be darker at the top, so I'll get some of that brown that we had mixed up before and go over the other colours with it, just to get a bit more shadow. And you'll see, sorry that's in the way, you'll see how I've got my brush on its side and I'm going in this direction to make that more of a tubular shape, which it is of course. And just tidy up that edge there. I think that's better, but I think we should perhaps just leave that branch now because it's not the main focus of the picture. The apple's the main focus of the picture. So let's have a look at the stem. Again, I'll use some of that brown, make it darker in places, but still have the green showing through. Needs to be a little bit greener down the bottom here. You see I've run that into that now. And again, straight from the pan, I'm going to get some of the yellow and just pop one or two of these shapes on these leaves where we've got these veins and some little dots and things. Just for that detail to be more than the detail we've got in these leaves in the background. Now all the time I've been painting this, I've been undecided about the background, whether we're going to do it dark or whether we're going to leave it white. But if I leave it white, this highlight here will not show up, neither will this or this, and the apple won't pop forward. So I think we really are going to have a look at doing the background. So the colour I'm going to make up is probably going to be very dark brown. I'll probably use that sepia and maybe put a touch of blue into that. I'm hoping that the light hasn't changed too much for you now looking at this. It's all of a sudden gone very dark and started raining, so it's the light's changed a little bit for me in here. So I've made up some of the dark sepia along with some French ultramarine to make this nice dark colour. And the thing about this is when we're working wet on to dry is have plenty of paint made up. You really don't want to be running out halfway through. And I'm going to use this nice big brush for applying this. And although it's a big brush, it's got a lovely point to the end of it there. So we can get plenty of paint applied by using the brush on its side, but we can also get into those little edges and get this paint applied before it dries out too much, because it holds plenty with it being a nice big brush. I actually think it's quite nice to leave a tiny little gap there. If you want to go right up to the green, you could do. You might want to move your paper around again at this point to be able to get into those edges. I'm hoping you can still see that. It's made quite a nice shape, that impressionistic bit of a leaf that's behind there. So I'm just going to let it fade out on that edge. So I'm just going to wet my brush Squeeze the excess water out and just dampen that edge there to let that fade away. So down the edge of that masking fluid now, and this is what's going to make that highlight pop out, and it wouldn't have done if we'd left that paper white. So again, I'm going to move things around. I have to be quite careful in here. You might want to swap for a smaller brush. I've just gone over the edge of that leaf slightly, rushing a little bit. But that leaf's nice and dry, so with a dry brush we can just tidy that up. Just a fiddly little shape around that little bud. So just do a segment at a time of this background. You could have done this first if you wanted to. I just couldn't make my mind up whether I wanted a background or not. One, two little shapes. I don't think it's necessary to put anything above the branch. You could also go darker than I've gone if you want. See where it's drying, it's actually quite light, but it's going to be darker than those highlights. Just tidying up one or two of those edges. And it's going to be quite a dappled light behind there. Pooling a little bit there because it's in the shade of the tree. It seems a lot darker there than it does over here, but that hasn't dried quite the same. So I think that this is more or less dry now, so we should be able to take that off in a moment. Okay, so that's completely dry now. So now with a very clean, dry finger, we can take off this masking fluid. You can do this with an eraser as well if you like. I prefer to do it with my finger because with your finger you can feel where you've missed it. But you must have a nice clean finger, obviously. That background colour could have been quite a bit darker if we'd wanted. Would have made these highlights pop out more. So you can see there we've got the highlight on the bottom is really white because that's the white of the paper, and then we've got these highlights here which are that first wash that we put on. It's where we put the masking fluid over the top of the paint. I hadn't actually painted over those ones that I've just rubbed off, but they were there just in case. And we had some here. Now if you have a really clean hand you can do this and you just feel where you've missed any masking fluid, and I haven't missed any there. Okay, so for my mind this background isn't dark enough. I could go on again now and put another layer on that, but I think I'll leave it for today. You could think about that going darker on yours to get a bit more contrast between the highlights and the darkest areas. You can see here we've got all these mid-tones. We've got the mid-tones of the branch and the apple and the leaves. We've got the highlights in where it's the brightest, but really this needs to be much darker for that to pop forward. So I'll leave that to you what colour you want to do that. Actually, if you look at this, it's not black. You could go with a very, very dark green actually. That would be quite nice, a very dark green rather than the sepia that I've used, but I do quite like the sepia. It's a nice warm colour. Okay, so I hope you found that useful. A few little tips and things in there. Basically just building it up as you go along, and you could carry on and build more detail up, but I think the main thing with this apple is to get the shape in there. Actually, I needed to perhaps just tidy things up a little bit at the end. You might just want to put a bit extra just to highlight where that stalk is there, and just to get some sharper lines in at the end. But you know, we could go on forever doing that. So I'm going to call it a day. I hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget the reference photograph is linked down in the description below if you did want to have a go at this yourself. It's a really nice little exercise because you've got the exercise of both drawing the apple and getting these different tones in with this super highlights that we've got going on with the sun shining on the side of the apple there. So let me know how you go on in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.